Hello and welcome to today's GrowthChat. We are very delighted to have Sara Lowes here, who is an assistant professor at the University of California in San Diego. Welcome, Sara.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So today we will be talking about a paper of yours with Eduardo Montero, which is coming out in the American Economic Review, and it's about colonial medicine in Africa and how it has effect still on today's medical outcomes. So maybe you should get us going in describing what today is problems we see in Africa when the World Bank tries to run health campaigns.
Sure. So the project was basically motivated actually by the observation that during the Ebola outbreaks that happened a couple years ago now, though there's still ongoing outbreak in Congo, sort of the large levels of mistrust that people had of foreign doctors in particular, but also of medical interventions. And sort of anecdotally, there's lots of evidence that sort of there are large levels of mistrust in medicine, and that this is a particular barrier for sort of people seeking out healthcare in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's sort of related to sort of broader research that suggests that even when you have sort of really low price points, even when you make things really accessible, sort of things are underutilized. So people are underutilizing access to healthcare. And so we thought that maybe one sort of barrier to people accessing healthcare might be mistrust in medicine. And so that sort of is part of what got us started on this project, is sort of those observations.
So Sara, could you maybe give us a brief overview of what you do in the paper?
Of course, thank you. So as I mentioned, we're sort of interested in understanding sort of mistrust in medicine, and we're focusing on medical campaigns conducted by the French military between the 1920s and the 1950s. So basically, they were interested in trying to eradicate and treat sleeping sickness, which is a lethal disease spread by the tsetse fly. And in order to do that, they organized these mobile medical teams that would go into rural areas and forcibly inject people with medications that were meant to either treat or prevent sleeping sickness. So to just give you a sense of these medications, the sort of early versions of them were arsenic based and had really severe side effects. So that could include basically blindness and death. And so what we do is we use historical data that has really granular information on when and where these medical teams visited over the course of 30 years. We digitize that. We find that basically millions of individuals over the course of this time period were exposed to these medical campaigns. And then we match this historical data with present day data from the demographic and health surveys for our countries of interest. And what's nice about the DHS data is that they have information on vaccination for children. And they also have information on willingness to consent to free and non-invasive blood tests for either HIV and anemia. And we're using those as our measures of mistrust in medicine today. And then we also sort of find basically that exposure to these campaigns is associated with lower vaccination rates for children and sort of less willingness to consent to these blood tests, which we interpret as evidence of mistrust. We then ask sort of, does this have implications for the efficacy of sort of health interventions more broadly? In order to ask that question, we look at data from the World Bank. So we have data on sort of World Bank projects that have been implemented across our countries of interest. And we find that exposure historically to our campaigns is associated with sort of worse outcomes for projects in the health sector that have been implemented by the World Bank, but we don't find equivalent effects for projects in other sectors. And we sort of interpret this as suggestive evidence that indeed sort of this matters more broadly for the efficacy of health interventions in our setting.
Okay.
What is the historical background? So you use historical data of a specific country. Also, which country did you focus on?
Yeah, thank you. So for the project, we focus on former French Equatorial Africa. So Chad, Gabon, Central African Republic, and the Republic of Congo, and then Cameroon, because it was sort of managed in the same way as former French Equatorial Africa. The reason we focus on those is that they were basically the target of these really extensive medical campaigns organized by the French military during the colonial era. And sort of what turned us on to this is actually there's this really interesting book called The Origins of AIDS by an epidemiologist, Jack Pepin. And he had this hypothesis that actually the origins of HIV were partially related to these really extensive medical campaigns and the reuse of unsanitary needles in Central Africa and other sort of parts of former French colonies. And so that sort of turned us on to sort of what might this be the role in shaping mistrust. And also he mentions in his book sort of that there are these really great archives with really great data, which, you know, for economists is basically like the best news ever. So that's sort of the historical context, is understanding the role of these historical medical campaigns in former French Equatorial Africa for shaping mistrust in medicine today.
Okay, so you are trying to link essentially what happened decades ago from the 1920s to 1950s to health outcomes today. And the idea is that people, say grandparents, great-grandparents, would tell their own children, grandchildren that medicine is no good, and that somehow how these historic experiences still influence today, right?
Yeah, so that can be one particular channel through which sort of you have an intergenerational transmission of sort of mistrust in medicine. I don't know if it even needs to be that explicit. It can just be that sort of your parents or your grandparents choose not to like engage with the health sector, and you sort of learn to avoid it. But there is some evidence of even sort of very well-articulated actual mistrust in medicine. So we came across this song from an ethnic group in central Cameroon that's basically documenting these campaigns, talking about how they would come to inoculate you against sleeping sickness, but then they would force you to do it. And then they would also have you do some forced labor on the side. And also it was really painful. Oh. And so you can get the sense of how people then might learn that sort of inoculations are scary, or how you might mistrust sort of foreign medical interventions.
Yeah.
Is it mistrust in medicine or mistrust in institution and foreign people?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's a difficult one to tackle. We try to do this a little bit in our paper. So when we're trying to understand how these historical medical campaigns have shaped trust in medicine, we have two outcomes. So one is sort of basically whether or not you get vaccinations for your children. So that's one strategy. And then we have this revealed preference measure of trust, which is basically willingness to consent to a free and non-invasive blood test for either HIV or anemia. And so we think of these as two potential proxies for trust in medicine. We don't actually have survey data for trust in medicine. And then we do an exercise where we do actually have sort of questions on trust in other people and institutions from the Afrobarometer. And so we sort of asked, do we see a similar effect of exposure to these medical campaigns on these other measures of trust in, say, like your local leader or parliament or the police? And sort of across all of these other measures of trust, we find no systematic relationship between exposure to our campaigns and trust in these other people and institutions. And so we interpret our effects as specific to trust in medicine rather than to sort of broader, more generalized trust.
Fascinating. So you already talked about some of the data sources, the health service from Africa and the Afrobarometer, but you shared your excitement with also the historical records. Maybe you can tell us a bit of where you found them and how you digitized them and all that.
Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. So sort of we were turned on to this data from this book on the origins of AIDS, the Jack Pepin book. And he was kind enough to tell us, you know, sort of which archives he visited. And so we went to these archives in Toulon. And we took, I would say, like 20,000 photos over the course of 2 weeks, which is a lot of photos. And my hard drive said no. We had to like buy like additional hard drives for all of those photos. And so we felt really proud of ourselves because we went through, you know, all of these records for all of these countries and took all of these photos. But then the problem is once you have that many photos, you have to do something with them. So then we had the trouble of sort of cataloging them and figuring out really what the right tables to digitize in all of these different records were. And so the digitization process wasn't really that simple because these weren't sort of the types of records that you could easily OCR or use sort of some automatic software to read in sort of the values in the tables. So the really old ones are like handwritten. And then even the ones that use typewriters, like it just wasn't going to be recognizable unless you had a really, really clean shot. So we also work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what's nice about that is while we were doing our field work for these other projects, we could hire people to do data entry for our tables because all the records are in French, and then the people we hire in Congo are speak French. So That took a while. And then there was the fun process of harmonizing sort of the observations across time. So of course, like boundaries change over time. So then there was a little bit of harmonization there. So that's a little bit of the process, but we did get to spend a couple of weeks in Provence, you know, visiting the archives. So that's some of the best field work I've done, probably.
Sounds fun.
Yeah, it wasn't so
like
bad.
a lot of wine and a lot of champagne there.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's a nice rosé.
So that's the good side. But I bet there was like challenging aspect that you mentioned some of them. Is there something else that happened that was very challenging writing the paper? How long did it take to write the paper? And what do you find exciting about this line of research?
Okay. I don't want to discourage people with how long it takes to write these papers. I think we started in like 2013, so that's scary when we think about that too hard. But I mean, the digitization process really did take a long time. What was particularly hard? I mean, as with most econ papers, as soon as you answer one question, people want you to answer like 8 more. So yeah. Sort of figuring out what the right things to focus on was also a bit of a challenge. And then of course, you know, with most economics papers, we're also worried about identification, and coming up with what would be a credible identification strategy in this context was also a bit challenging. So we end up using an instrumental variable, but those have their own issues. So, but these are pretty standard problems with economics papers, I think.
In general, your favorite part of research, what it is, like on a personal level, what is exciting about the line of research that you do?
Oh, well, you know, actually, my favorite part, I think, of research is that I got to spend a lot of time in the field. So like I mentioned earlier, most of my ongoing projects are in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which isn't part of the paper we're actually talking about today. But I just find it fun to spend time in, you know, places that I don't know, or at this point I do know Congo, but getting to know people and sort of understanding sort of the types of problems they face and what sort of barriers there might be to sort of improving development outcomes in these contexts. And then I in particular focus on sort of cultural and institutional factors that may matter for understanding development outcomes.
Now, going back a bit further in time in your own life, did you always want to become an economist, or did you start out on something else and then you switched later? So what made you turn to economic history and Africa and all that?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I didn't even realize one could be like an economist or a development economist until like most of the way through undergraduate. And then I realized, you know, you could be a development economist, and that sounded so cool because you get to, you know, probably travel and hopefully do research that's impactful, and you get to make your own schedule, among other things. So it seemed like this nice combination of really cool things. Then I learned that I had to take all of this math that I had no idea about. So that was a fun barrier. And I figured that out over the following couple of years. While I was also sort of doing field work in developing countries. So I was working in Uganda for a while, in Vietnam, Zambia. So sort of combined sort of getting research experience with getting that preparation that's required for applying to grad school. So no, I wouldn't say I was always aspiring to be an economist, but once I figured out it was an option, I thought, okay, that would be pretty fun. And I haven't been able to come up with something more fun that I'd like to do. So it seems okay for the time being. Yeah.
Yeah.
Really doing field work, I think it's exciting. Traveling.
It is exciting.
Do you have any other project working on now? Do you have any other projects you're working on now?
Yeah. So a kind of fun project that I'm working on now has to do with belief in witchcraft and sort of how these traditional superstitious beliefs affect pro-social behavior. And so it's sort of motivated by other work and sort of the relationship between religion and behavior. And like we have evidence that sort of religions with moralizing gods can increase the extent and scope of cooperation, but we don't have a lot of evidence on how this other set of beliefs, supernatural beliefs, which are really widespread, both historically and presently, how these matter for pro-social behavior. And in Congo in particular, belief in witchcraft is really widespread. At least when I spend time there, it's really evident that it matters for the way people understand misfortune in their lives, for the choices that they make on a daily basis. And so trying to explore that is sort of what we're working on. This is joint work with Nathan Nunn and Etienne Le Rossignol. So
nice. And you find witchcraft beliefs also among Christian populations, or is it mostly among non-Christians? No, everyone.
Yeah, I think
many people hold witchcraft beliefs.
Among like the people we work with, most people identify as Christian. I mean, like 98% of people. So these are sort of beliefs that people hold simultaneous with sort of being practicing Christians.
Yeah, wow.
And that's pretty common.
Amazing.
In fact, oftentimes churches will incorporate some of, churches often sort of incorporate some of these superstitious beliefs into their own sort of practices. So like you can go to the church in order to get protected from witchcraft, for example. So there isn't any sort of real tension in that sense. Though, of course, the Christian churches tend to like discourage practice of witchcraft.
Yeah.
We should have another interview on this paper.
Yeah,
Sascha.
definitely.
Okay.
I agree. We should do that. Yeah. But when is your next trip anywhere? Are you currently stuck in California, or will you be able to get to Africa anytime soon to pursue your research?
Well, stuck in California sounds dramatic because it's actually very pleasant here. But yeah, I don't know when we'll get the vaccine over here, but I hope to travel this summer because, you know, the last trip I took was in January 2020, right before COVID. And I'm very thankful I managed to get that in there before this whole COVID thing. So I'm hoping soon. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll be able to travel and explore archives, because at this stage, if you do economic history and you can't travel, it's kind of a problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sara. That was super interesting, and yet another example that there are legacies of what the Europeans did all around the world, and didn't only bring blessings, but also all kinds of trouble that lasts into modern times. So thank you so much for sharing that, and I hope we can see you again at some future point. Have a nice afternoon. Thanks again.
So much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Sascha, for running the interview, and thank you, Sara. I'll see you at the next episode. Bye-bye.